Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our fourth episode, and as you can see, bit of a change of scenery behind me. It's actually been about 2 or 3 months since we last recorded an episode, isn't it? But and I've moved house in between, and so it's taken a little while. And today we're going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of social science and humanities and arts ventures. But first, the most important thing I've got to tell you all, and this might disappoint some who are watching. This is a lunchtime recording, and given I'm not in my PhD days anymore, we've actually we're trying out some alcohol-free beer. So this is the one I'm trying, Chris. It's an Erdinger alcohol-free isotonic. Yeah, it's got all sorts of good things in it, you know. So that's and not well apart from the alcohol, which is usually the best bit. What have you got?
Well, and they actually hand those out after you do like a race in Germany because it's isotonic, and it's good marketing. So I've got you probably can't see it, but a Beavertown Laser Crush, which is also alcohol-free IPA. So it's very wholesome this lunchtime.
Yeah, it is, and so maybe we won't be quite as bold in what we say, but well, it's what we're going to be talking about today is what is it actually like on the ground to get these social science and humanities ventures off the ground, and I suppose the first thing to do is to actually talk about, well, where are we starting from? And maybe Chris, could you start by describing a typical patent science spin out?
Yeah, I can, although I should add that I've done very few, so this may be a caricature of the science spin out from my more science colleagues. But
well, don't worry, I'll keep you on track because I have done a few, but go on.
So I would say that the typical sort of science spin out really starts with the intellectual property identification, and basically the question is it patentable? And that's partly because if you can patent it, you need to do it quickly because the academic usually wants to publish on it. It's also because your commercial strategy often will be built around the fact that you patented the intellectual property, and that's really what's going to help protect you when you go out and try and basically flog it. And it's also that investors like a patent because correctly they see it as a sort of defensive wall, a moat around the venture. So the OUI, Oxford University Innovation, the technology transfer managers will be racing around, identifying the intellectual property, trying to push it through quickly and get the patent out. And once they've got the patent, then you can start having sort of slightly broader conversations around, all right, how are we going to turn this into a venture? Who's going to run it? Are you going to run it? Is someone else going to run it? And then once you've kind of done some of those early stage ones, there's a lot of detail that I'm skating over here about who goes on the intellectual property form and who's named. Once you've got through that, you basically build a proposition, you build what you hope is the team that can at least take the venture out at the start, and you basically go and speak to investors. And usually, if the investor likes it, or an investor likes it, that's the point at which you spin out. The investor says, I like it, I'm willing to put in this much. You agree on the kind of equity terms, and it spins out of the university with the investment.
Yeah, that's a key thing because you actually need that investment to pay for the patent. You know, there's an awful lot of cost which has been built up as you're protecting it, and it's evolved by the way in which like legislation developed in the US and how technology transfer offices set up in the UK as well, which was that they were set up literally just to sell the IP that the universities generated through research, and venture creation came after that because it was found that particular intellectual properties that were generated didn't have anything to license to. You know, who name those big corporate quantum quantum computing companies out there? There aren't any licensees for that, so you have to actually make your own company to get going. So that's science. Now we're going to move on to social science and humanities, and I suppose the obvious thing to start with there is, so what's the IP and does it work?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that is the key question, because you start that science process and you immediately come to the first hurdle, which is actually, it's really hard to patent things. It's hard even to patent software. I mean, if you look at how many fights there are in Silicon Valley over trying to patent bits of code between Google and Apple and all the rest of it, and they often can't enforce their patents well without armies of lawyers. It gives you a sense of how hard patenting can actually be. And usually the steer we get is that you can only get a patent if it basically pertains to a physical system. Basically stuff you can touch. And the thing is, in the social sciences and the humanities, the intellectual property tends not to be stuff you can touch. It might be database, it might be software, but it's also more likely to be things like a framework or a methodology, or even softer bits of intellectual property, such as manuals and other bits of like written material, guides, etc., none of which can be patented. And so basically you get to that first hurdle, and the academic might have spoken to their science colleagues, and they will probably say, yeah, you want to get that patent out early to protect yourself. And they come to us, and then we say, actually, you can't patent that. And then right away, we've deviated from the traditional path of technology transfer.
Well, this is what I say. I think you can actually apply for a patent in anything, but there are certain patent applications which are a complete waste of time. And whether you actually ever get these things granted is a different question. I mean, software, as you say, is difficult enough to get granted. I've filed lots of software patents. Not many of them have become granted. There have been a few, but it's difficult, far more difficult to get them over the line. So, I mean, I suppose it's fair to say that this is a big problem for technology transfer offices who set up to license IP. They can't file any patents, so what do they license?
Yeah, I mean, they basically try and license the softer intellectual property, which they still need access to. If you've developed a framework or a methodology for, I don't know, assessing a company on its ethical frameworks, for example, or how ethical it is, you still need access to those materials to do it. Someone has to give you the rights to use them, including the rights to use them commercially. So it's not like you can't do a license deal, but what you don't have is the same moat that you would have if you had a patent against it. You can't just say, here's my patent, and by the way, nobody can effectively copy me in this precise way because I've got a patent. You'd have no legal mechanism. And so usually there's a bit of panic at that point, because they've been told that the patent is the way to defend everything. And then they're sort of like, well, what's my defense? What's my moat?
And it's just copyright, though, isn't it? I mean, when you just when you're just writing a methodology down, we're talking about copyright here, aren't we?
Exactly. Which you don't have to do anything. You've kind of got out of the door, but it's not a moat. And so then, and this is the area that we've both been focused on, which is, okay, but a moat is still a good thing if you're trying to commercialize something. You still want a way to distinguish yourself and make it harder for people that want to copy you to do so. What are you going to do? And what
do you do then? Tell us what you do.
Well, we would say you've got to try and build a brand around yourself, that you are a researcher at university, which is objectively a prestigious position to hold. It's a position of trust. It's not the same as if just anyone on the street just came up with the same idea. If you had two people saying the same idea, but one of them was, for example, an Oxford academic, the Oxford academic is going to be the one people trust and want to work with. That's the advantage of a researcher. They're trusted because of what they do. And the second part that you have is that you came from the university itself, and universities have big brands. They've been working on their brands for a long time. Oxford's been working on its brand for 1,000 years. So you have these two bits, which are actually not easy to replicate. Not everyone can just be a researcher, and not everyone can be a researcher at a university. And so having those two things and saying, right, if I've got those two things, those ingredients, maybe I can start building something around what my company is, why people can trust it, why they know that I will be the best person to deliver this product or service around that. That is defensible. And the thing is you have to do that anyway, even if you had a patent. You still have to build a brand and build a reason that people should engage with you. So that's why I think it's not the negative it necessarily is perceived to be at the start.
But I suppose to somebody who's been a dyed-in-the-wool technology transfer professional, they'll maybe think that this is a bit nebulous, a bit difficult to describe. Maybe it's worth talking through a few maybe high-level examples of just what I mean. So how do you build a brand? I mean, what examples can you bring? You know, and how do you build something that is of value? And I suppose it's a more broadens to a question as how does somebody in our position provide the support to these new ideas in building those brands? What support do they actually need?
Yeah, I mean, I think the really truthful answer is we're only at the start of working out how you build a brand around university sort of shape spin-outs. So I'd never sell myself as an expert in this. I think we do start off thinking about making sure that they communicate their relationship to the university as the first part of their brand. And sometimes that's very easy at Oxford because they want the word Oxford in their name, or they want Ox in their name. The second part is, at least at Oxford University Innovation, you can use the spin-out logo that we have, which obviously includes the university's logo as well as our own. And that does mean that you're communicating very clearly your relationship to the university. And I think that's quite powerful. It's kind of always worth remembering the Oxford brand really does go quite far, and it's obviously not the only university that can pull that trick off. I think the latter bits though, which is like, you know, what do you do as a TTO that says this is nebulous? I think actually that's a tough one, because I don't think TTOs have had to consider that before, because usually if you were doing a science spin out, building the brand would come a lot later. It's kind of, you know, once you're kind of up and running, then you start thinking about a brand. Once you're selling, it's like, okay, now we've got a bit of spare cash, we can bring in a brand consultant, do some comms, get some color schemes going, you know, think about the mission and vision, which is.
So are you saying that everything, so the things are done in a different order then?
They're done in a different order, but I would say this, a lot of the science spin outs we do, often they're not ready to sell on day one after they've spun out. Sometimes there's more research to do. And even if they are ready to sell, usually they already know a lot of the customer that they're targeting. It might be NHS, it might be another provider. It's quite well structured market. In that sense, some of their strategy is a little bit not easy, but simpler in terms of what they need to do. Won't necessarily be easy at all. For the social science spin outs, the shape spin outs, you're not normally going into a kind of well-defined market. It is a more nebulous market, which means you have to define and work out the strategy really early on. And the basics of brand usually start with the basics of strategy. What are we trying to achieve? What does success look like in 5 years? Who are we selling to? And then we have to build a brand around that. So actually the fact that you have to build a brand early is linked with the fact you have to build a strategy earlier anyway, because the whole area you're going into is more nebulous. So I don't think it's as
So talking about strategy then, I mean, so obviously that leads us on to business models, and so so the science business model is essentially let's create a company into which we're going to sink lots of cash. We're going to get these patents, so we're going to actually build some prototypes and then maybe make some demonstrate that the technology works. Usually not selling a thing, and then with the hope of being acquired by a big corporate of some description who are then going to absorb all of that IP and then use that as a mechanism to actually enhance their product range with using the technology that's been developed. So obviously you mentioned there that you're talking about the potential to sell much early on, sell a product or whatever it is much early on. So what does that do for the business models and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is usually the social science, we'll say shape from now on, we'll get on brand ourselves.
Yeah, let's get on brand. Yeah, let's do it.
We'll say with shape spin outs, they're usually actually ready to commercialize earlier in some form, because they're not, you know, they're usually not developing. By the time they get to commercialization, they've usually done the hard yards on the research and even the translational research. It's not kind of, you're not in that situation of, well, this works in the lab and now it's going to take 2 years for us to demonstrate kind of real world efficacy. That's really difficult. So they more have to kind of, they can sell earlier. If you've got a framework and you've already used it once, then there's not really anything stopping you using it a second time. So if we go back to the example of, looking at kind of ethical review of a company, how do you do it systematically? How do you measure it? Well, if you've done it once, you can fairly quickly adapt it to another company. That basically means you can commercialize a lot faster out the gate. But what it means is that you're not really a sort of investable startup in the sense that the technology transfer officers are looking for, because you're basically probably one, maybe a handful of people who can basically offer a service. And you're basically a consultancy. And that's actually a business model that we haven't produced. We don't typically produce in the technology transfer offices. We produce basically STEM startups where you take in the VC money, and you have to, because you're probably gonna have to pay for lots of equipment, like a lab or loads of computers. And instead, we're building a consultancy. And we haven't really done that before. Now, the disadvantage is we don't have necessarily the experience, but the advantage is basically equipment free, practically. You can basically get going straight away because it's people. So what they really need is the time to do it more than anything else, and just in the company to do it. And I think that's a big advantage, but it is a shift for us, because it's sort of saying, instead of sort of saying, right, we're all heading towards an investor and that's really our goal here, we're actually saying, how do we get you ready to service your first client?
So what you're suggesting, well, that's right. And you're suggesting there that the technology transfer offices themselves need to shift their own business model in order to accommodate and provide support for that, because you have actually got income coming into these businesses far earlier, and there's a potential source of being able to get your own investment back much easier, much earlier as well, but not necessarily in the same way. So it means that different agreements are required and things like that. But the thing is, the business models of all tech transfer offices are quite different, and so technology transfer offices have to work out what their own support is in that regard. But you're quite right, yeah. Certainly the business models I've seen do lend themselves to just sort of much earlier income. I mean, just going back onto the brand thing, I mean, I think that because we were talking about examples, or I wondered if there were examples that were relevant. And, like for one example I had, which came around protection, somebody had come up with a methodology which was in anthropology. And he asked me, how can I protect myself using this methodology? And I said that you go to the conference and tell everybody about it and show them that you're the very best person in the field to actually do this intervention. Because though the methodology, the questions, the survey that it was asking people was very straightforward, actually the value in actually taking the answers back from that survey and crunching it using anthropological theory into something that made sense and give you insight was a skill. Yeah. And it wasn't something that anyone else would be able to do without extensive training. And it was that was his protection. So in terms of his brand building, it was, well, this is a service that you can sell to people and get income in really straightforwardly. And then his method of growth is essentially becoming like training the trainers, as it were, sort of learning how to, teaching a small group of people, how to use the methodology. Takes a long time. But enables growth that way. It's interesting. I love it. I love the variety in it as well.
I think there's another bit though, which is building on your point, is basically, what do you want to do if you want to kind of protect yourself? Well, yeah, it's announce it to the world, but it's basically go to market as early as possible and declare yourself the best. Yes. Nothing beats declaring that you are the gold standard, so that even if a whole field emerges after you with copycats, realistically, everyone wants to work with the gold standard and said they worked with the gold standard.
Yeah.
And obviously universities are very good at saying, well, we are the gold standard by definition. So that's a lesson that I think academics intuitively should like.
Well, that's the important thing about research, is you can't publish anything unless it's new. It's got to be novel, right? It has to be first. So it's so if you've got something which is new, then you've got a great opportunity to actually sell a service on the back.
Exactly. I mean, if you were a scientist and you basically have made a new discovery, you wanted everyone you wanted the protection. The protection is to publish in Nature as soon as possible with you as first author.
Yes.
you're in Nature, you're first author. That's your defense. So now everyone that came second isn't really going to get a look in.
And that's right. I mean, and the thing is, the other thing about, I mean, so then the question then becomes, which is what we were discussing in our last podcast, which was, well, why make a venture? Why not just do it as consulting? Well, I think and the answer to that is, well, you're often providing the same consultancy over and over again, and that's where and it becomes a service, then it becomes a product, and that is when you actually want to start thinking about making a company.
I think that's right, and I think it's also that you can do consulting, but it'll depend, one, on the university's own capacity to do lots of consulting. Some of them can do it quite easily, but I think if you just restrict it to in-house consultancy, you're kind of, as you're alluding to, you're restricting the opportunity of the company to grow, basically.
Yeah.
Because if you do create a company, after a while, that company is going to start servicing more clients. Hopefully, you might want to hire staff. Well, those staff can't work for the university if all they're really doing is just consulting for your business.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I mean, so what help? I mean, what can we do as realistically in technology transfer offices to help? Maybe we should be calling them knowledge transfer offices from now on, or and knowledge exchange offices. I mean, but what sort of help do these companies need to get going and to grow?
So we've discussed before, at kind of Oxford, we had the lean spin out model, which is, for those that can't remember or don't want to scroll back, that's basically around £5,000 that we basically offer as an interest-free loan to companies to pay for the incorporation costs, first year of legal support, first year of accountancy support. Because if you don't need investment, you still need a little bit of cash just to get the ball rolling. And so we offer that, which I think is a great start. I think the other bit that we can offer is through our networks, which is trying to get them their first proper client. It's not necessarily that we can deliver the first client to them, but we can usually put them in touch with the right people to validate what their first kind of proposition should be. If they're selling to local authorities, then we make sure that they can speak to 2 or 3 and work out if any local authority wants it, could afford it, what the procurement process is. If they're selling into the private sector, can we do a pilot project with one of them? Maybe we know some friendly companies in the Oxford area who might be happy, maybe not to pay for it, but at least to kind of pilot it. And I think those are probably the most important things that we can do. So I think networks really count for a lot.
And the funding issue, I mean, I suppose, I mean, obviously we've got the lean spin out, which is, spinning out a company for the price of filing a patent. That's essentially what we're trying to do there. And we don't think too hardly about splashing £5,000 out of the patent. So why not start a company for the same price and get some money in far earlier? But they need more than that, though, don't they? Because sometimes you do need a little bit of investment or something, or a loan or some grant money just to get things going. Sometimes, the biggest problem with the consultancy business is cash flow, isn't it? And just trying to, being able to employ people in order to sell a product. There's still a little bit of investment needed, or sometimes there might be a requirement for, social science companies, for instance, rely on lots of data, and you need to store that data, and you need to do it securely and organize it in a particular way. All sorts of GDPR things associated with it as well. So what's the funding landscape look like?
I mean, the short answer is it's not ideal, as I think we know, because you in part created Impact 12 precisely because there was a massive hole in the funding landscape for these sorts of ventures. The problem you have is that you can't get a bank loan because you haven't been trading for long enough to qualify for a bank loan, which is obviously the typical route. And most of the impact investors, so investors that kind of might be more inclined to the things social scientists produce because they're trying to produce sort of positive societal or environmental outcomes, one, they like to see a company usually with trading history, or two, they're not really investing in consultancies. They're investing in sort of more in the tech for good space. So something with a super scalable growth model, which basically means it has to have a software basis to it. Which then begs the question, where do they get the capital from? Well, Impact 12 is one option. I think we hope that venture philanthropy could be an option. It will depend on the sector, but we know that Gates Foundation, for example, have have got involved in funding sort of social ventures. And maybe there's an angel opportunity. But I think beyond that, we don't have a clear answer yet on what that is. And we might never get one. I think it will probably be that we have to sort of piece a few options together.
On the angel thing, I mean, you're definitely looking for a different type of angel to the one that regularly hangs around traditional tech transfer office. If you to look around the Oxford ecosystem, as you would expect, it's very heavily biased towards people who are interested in the healthcare sector, because it's got a massive research hospital in Oxford, which and all sorts of innovations coming out of that. There are a few tech investors as well, who are keen on engineering and software and that sort of thing. But being able to show, would they be interested in a social science methodology company? Well, it's something which is going to be quite separate to anything that they've seen before. And I've often wondered whether approaching the dragons on Dragon's Den and people like that would be a more appropriate group of people to speak to, because when you look at the ventures that are coming through there, it's all branding stuff. It is. It's often gym equipment or holidays or I've seen all sorts of things on there. Reggae sauce. It's just branding, right? But it takes a lot of time to build up a new and a lot of investment in time to build up a new network of people, doesn't it? And to be able to have enough momentum so that people would actually look your way. And that's difficult. So the last thing I want to talk about is the importance of strategic partnerships, and maybe you sort of take the lead on this discussion here. Is this is sort of leading into our next podcast next week, which is going to be more about, well, what do we need to do at a UK level? And you've done an awful lot of work in sort of pooling strategic partnerships together. But I mean, maybe you just want to run through the sort of the benefits of such an approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the case that there are different types of strategic partnerships. Sometimes you work with a partner during the research stage to produce an outcome, and often that's great because there's already a kind of external to academia interest sort of already in there, and that usually makes the partnership a lot easier, and commercializing it can also be easier because that external actor probably has commercial business models, etc. One we see probably most common though, at least I've seen so far in Shape, is government, basically, usually local government, but it can be NGOs. And it's usually where the researcher has been basically co-producing with an NGO or a local authority. They've been testing an intervention or a new way of measuring things, and they sort of don't want it to stop once the research grant has ended, because they've probably got something important about how you can improve child outcomes, or you can improve mental health, or something around that particular area they've targeted. So then what you need to do is think, okay, well, right, this is going to be a pretty tight business model. It's not like these areas which are typically funded by government, sort of areas like health and social care or the environment. There's not a lot of money sloshing around usually at this level. So then what do they do to kind of make sure this survives? Well, one is a strategic partnership, and that might be where you partner up with the local authority, but perhaps the one you worked with on the original research grant, or if you didn't work with them, that's your first port of call. If you didn't work with them at the start, you probably need to have a strategic partnership to know if your research can really translate into something that they can use. If you've got an intervention with a local authority, does it work with this local authority? Does it work with two, since they're all set up quite differently? Can they procure it? They have lots of procurement guidelines and systems that you have to go through. You need to find that out. Is it usable? Will it take their staff more time? Basically, basics of market validation, but particularly when you're involved in this sector, you can't just go and flog to any business. There's a limited number, so you really have to be on target if you want to work with them. And usually that's the best place to start. So we've seen some really great ones. In the ARC program, we've had partnerships with things like local authorities in Glasgow around certain health outcomes. We've seen mental health work with the Greater Manchester Authority, who are very actually innovative. Because they're a combined authority, they've got a bit more budget and flexibility to move on these things. And so these are absolutely critical. You can't go anywhere without these strategic partnerships. And you really want to probably do them almost before you spin out, because that is your market validation.
Yeah, absolutely right. So so to summarize what we've been discussing today, it looks different. Commercialization, the ventures actually look different in certain sizes to the traditional science. Light on the IP, which means the way in which you intervene and the support that you give is normally in a different order to the one that you would traditionally have in a science spin out. And that means that the type of service that you need to provide these to academics to get their ideas out of the door needs to be thought of in a different way. It also means that you need to get your investment in time back in a different way. So it means that you yourself as a technology transfer office has to change, and you also need to build a network of people around you that can help, and also helping ensuring that the business can grow and it's been properly tested through strategic partners, which is a really good way of pushing the agenda on. So that's very much on the small level. What we're going to be talking about next week, Chris, go on, let's give everyone a taster.
Yeah, so that's the kind of micro level. The macro that we're going to talk about next week is kind of what this looks like at a full ecosystem level. So, okay, if you're looking at it UK wide and you want to say, how do we get more Shape Ventures? What are the big sort of, I guess, like building blocks we need to put in place to make that happen? Where are the big problems? How can we affect a kind of systems level change? That's what we're going to be talking about next week.
And I'm really looking forward to that. And I hope you can all join us for that then. See you later. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.